splash and drip of water from the unseen blades. As the sounds grew louder, he ordered his second mate to hail the visitors. Across the Black River, an English voice called back. They were off a Barbados ship, and they came from America. A second or two later, a volley of small arms fire exploded in the darkness, and the captain knew at once what kind of men were coming toward his ship. Snellgrave shouted out to the first mate to open fire, but nothing happened. Shortly afterward, one of his officers informed him that the crew refused to bear arms. The captain was astonished. He was not the brutal kind of 18th century sea captain who might expect his orders to be disobeyed when so much was at stake. He believed in treating his crews humanely. Though he was a slaver, he was an honest and reasonable man and was much admired by the men who served under him. He went down into the steerage. He asked the men brusquely why they had not refused to fight. Their response was even more astonishing than their refusal. They could not find the chest in which the weapons were stored. This, as Snellgrave later learned, was true, for reasons of his own. His first mate, Simon Jones, had hidden it. By now the strange boat had come alongside. There was nowhere for the men of the bird galley to hide, nowhere they could go to evade the approaching terror. They listened in fear to the muffled voices, the dull thud of feet on the deck overhead, dark shapes against the starlit sky. The invaders swarmed up onto the quarterdeck, then drew their pistols and fired down into the steerage, hitting one of the sailors in the buttocks and wounding him so severely that he later died. Then they tossed a number of grenades down. Stunned by the noise and flash of the explosions, the acrid smoke and confusion, the bird galley's men cried out for quarter. Snellgrave had never come face to face with pirates before. He was to see all too much of them in the next weeks. By great good fortune, he lived to tell the hair-raising tale and returned to London to publish a volume entitled A New Account of Some Parts of Guinea and the Slave Trade. It is a fascinating document, for Snellgrave was a cool, acute, and not altogether unsympathetic observer, and his account of his experiences among the pirates offers rare insight into these strange practitioners of one of the oldest yet least understood of seafaring professions. The first man Snellgrave laid eyes upon was the pirate quartermaster, leader of the boarding party, who was the captain of the bird galley. Roared the marauder. "I had been till now," replied Snellgrave. In a fury, the quartermaster demanded to know how Snellgrave had dared order his crew to open fire. He had heard him give the order several times, the pirate said. Snellgrave told him that he believed it was his duty to defend the ship, to which the quartermaster made no reply, but pulled out his pistol, clamped it to the hapless captain's chest, and pulled the trigger. Snellgrave just had time to knock the gun aside before it went off, and the bullet creased his side, leaving him bloody but still alive. When the pirate quartermaster saw that the captain was still standing, he took his pistol by the muzzle and brought it down on Snellgrave's head, knocking him Thames just before the pirates boarded at the Bird Galley. He had suspected from the start that the boat rowing toward them was filled with pirates, and had made up his mind to sabotage any attempts to defend the vessel. After Snellgrave's wound was dressed, the captain was summoned before Coghlan, who told him, "I am sorry you have met with bad usage after quarter given, but was his friend and protector from then on. Okay, so let's just take a look at this picture. Here we see Captain Edward Lowe as he weathers a hurricane while a ship flounders offshore in this 18th century engraving. More than most pirates, Lowe had a split personality. He was a loving husband and father and was usually kind to married men whom he captured, otherwise he was feared as a ferocious brute of unequal cruelty who once killed 53 Spanish captives. At last, after what seemed a lifetime, the pirate captains and a number of crewmen held a council and decided to free Snellgrave. He was a good fellow, they judged, and now the tide being turned, recalled Snellgrave. They were as kind to me as they had been at first severe. As a gesture of respect, the pirates gave Snellgrave one of their prizes, the Bristol Snow, in exchange for the bird galley, together with what was left the bird galley's cargo, plus several £1,000s worth of goods taken from earlier prizes. The pirates even helped Snellgrave's crew transfer the goods. Later, the pirate captains held a farewell gala aboard Davis's ship. Which almost proved disastrous. In the middle of dinner, a fire broke out when someone accidentally set a candle too near a cask of rum and blew it up. A number of pirates fled to the boats or huddled together at the far end of the bowsprit because there were £30,000 of gunpowder on board. Others were too drunk to care, but 16 men fought the fire for nearly 2 hours until it was finally extinguished. A few of the pirates were so grateful for Snellgrave's help with the fire that one man proposed the good captain be obliged to go down the coast of Guinea with us, for I am told we cannot have a better pilot. But Captain Davis of the 3rd pirate vessel gained the man of the quarter-deck, and so on May the 10th, 1719, more than a month after his capture, Captain William Snellgrave's sojourn among the pirates ended. With what remained of his crew, he boarded the vessel the pirates had given him and sailed safely back to England to recount his experience. Captain Snellgrave's misadventure came at the height of the greatest outburst of piracy in all the annals of seafaring. Historians with a keen sense of irony have called it piracy's golden age, as in fact it was. For some pirates, it lasted barely 30 years, scarcely a wink of time's eye, starting at the close of the 17th century and ending in the first quarter of the 18th. In those tumultuous years, a number of political and economic circumstances conspired to send uncounted thousands upon thousands of desperate men swooping down upon the sea lanes of the world. Mostly they were a man by sewing up his lips with a sail needle, or set fire to a shipload of screaming horses, or to a slave ship packed with manacled Africans. But there were moments, as Snellgrave and others discovered, when they seemed almost touched by grace, when they could be moved by compassion, contrition, even love, among themselves, aboard their ships and in their hideouts. They were passionate advocates of a rude sort of democracy, with a high regard for justice and the rights of the individual, and a corresponding distaste for tyranny and the abuse of power. Crude and violent though they often were, they could be abundantly generous to those whom they liked and trusted, showering jewels and Arabian gold on the liquor traders and girls who oiled and sweetened their progress across the far-flung oceans of the tropic world. Shipmates precision, going slowly mad in the furnace heat of his cabin as he waits for prey at the mouth of the Red Sea. Henry Every, slipping home to Devon with a bag full of diamonds. The pirates of the Bahamas cheering their nemesis, Woodes Rogers, all the way from the beach to his fort. The body of the last great pirate, Captain Bartholomew Roberts, being dropped into the sea in his crimson coat and breeches and gilt finery. Images of smoking cannon and ships in flames, of oaths and drunken laughter, the click of dice on a deck, and the scream of a gale in the rigging, cries from the crow's nest, "A sail! A sail!" The shudder of ship's timbers receiving a broadside, the screams of the maimed and bone and brains in the scuppers, the clatter of golden doubloons, moudors, and pieces of eight, a girl in a hammock in the hot Devil's Island noon, or long Guinea night, and at the end of many a life, a hemp noose rough on the sunburned skin of the neck. It has been said that piracy is humanity's third oldest profession, after prostitution and medicine. Indeed, records show it has existed wherever the rewards of the crime have been worth the risk of punishment. Organised piracy flourished widely among the early civilizations of the Middle East. The coast of the Persian Gulf, between Qatar and Oman, was the haunt of generations of pirates who plundered the shipping of the Assyrian kingdoms and later harried the fleet of Alexander the Great. In the Mediterranean, piracy was accepted by merchants and seamen alike as an occupational hazard, and in the last 100 years of the Roman Republic, the pirates in the Mediterranean achieved such widespread power that they were able to sack some 400 towns along the richest town of the Spanish-American Empire. The distinction between these sea raiders and the pirates who followed them was as often as not in the eye of the beholder. The Spanish, in fact, flatly called them piratas, but Morgan and his cohorts regarded themselves as a special breed of privateer. They termed themselves buccaneers or boucanier. The term meant smoker of meat in French, and that is really what the early ones were, herdsmen and woodsmen on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, before they turned their hand to sea roving. These men insisted that their activities were perfectly legal, since all their depredations, no matter how piratical in character, were directed only against the Spanish. The British and the French acquiesced in this view. Morgan actually became Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, and to be sure, there was a grain of truth to the buccaneers' claim. The out-and-out pirates did not limit themselves to any one prey, but habitually attacked ships of every nationality. They were, in an early definition by the Roman lawyer Cicero, hosts humanae generi, enemies of the human race. Yet for all this, the line between privateer, buccaneer and pirate was a fine one. What was one to make of Englishmen and Frenchmen who, as the buccaneers did, plundered Spanish ships with equal zeal in times of truce as well as during hostilities? Did that make them pirates one day and heroes of Britain and France the next? In a sermon to his Boston congregation in 1704, the Reverend Cotton, here he is. The Reverend Cotton Mather warned that the privateering stroke so easily degenerates into the piratical, and the privateering trade is usually carried on with an unchristian temper, and proves an inlet into so much debauchery and iniquity. Years later, when piracy as such had largely ceased to exist, but there were still plenty of privateers, Admiral Horatio Nelson complained that the conduct of all privateers is, as far as I have seen, so near piracy that I only wonder any civilized nation can allow them. The particularly Caribbean form of privateering, come piracy, known as buccaneering, virtually died out after England made peace with Spain in 1689. By then, many veterans of buccaneering had turned to outright piracy, and their ranks were soon swollen by all kinds of disaffected sailors, anxious to improve their miserable lot by the acquisition of sudden riches from a captured prize. From the Caribbean, these men ranged out into virtually all the seas of the world, and they found profits aplenty, for it was a period of expansion in the international seaborne mercantile trade. By the end of the 17th century, ports and trading posts had been established along most of the inhabited seaboards of the world, and a multitude of ships of all shapes, sizes and nationalities ploughed along a complex network of shipping lanes, many of them bearing unbelievably valuable cargoes. There were Spanish treasure fleets laden with the priceless produce of the gold and silver mines of Spanish America, convoys of Portuguese merchantmen stuffed with the riches of Brazil, an endless stream of cargo boats shipping out the exports of the North American colonies to England, the ships of the Royal African Company and other European charter companies in Africa sea lanes of the world during the golden age of piracy. Yet, pirate plunder was valuable only if its value could be realised, if it could be sold or exchanged in a ready market, and it was North America that provided the greatest market. During much of the Golden Age, the pirates operated with the active support and cooperation of the governors, merchants and populace of most of the North American colonies. In England, pirates were hunted down remorselessly, but in American ports they were given protection and hospitality, ships, provisions, crews, fake privateer commissions, and a place to sell their booty. For the American colonies made a profit out of piracy, just as the pirates themselves did. What is more, by condoning piracy, the Americans struck a blow against British rule in a growing struggle that was to culminate in the American War of Independence. Among the particular circumstances that turned the Americans into a nation of pirate brokers was the series of navigation acts passed by the English government beginning in 1651. Originally, their object was to protect the British shipping trade from Dutch competition. The Acts stipulated that virtually no goods could be imported into England or her colonies except in British ships manned by British subjects. Moreover, most colonial imports and exports had to come from and go to England alone. The effect was to create a near monopoly of both shipping and trade by the mother country. Right, I'm actually going to show you these pages. So this is a catalogue of booty, high and low. So what do we see? We can see a list of pirate booty here from 1688, which shows mundane goods to be as much a part of the swag as the legendary pieces of 8. Silver Spanish coins worth 8 reals that were often cut into pieces to make small change. Though pirates coveted precious jewels, they wanted gold and silver even more, and they regarded coins, which were easily divided into equal shares, as the greatest booty of all. It is easy to imagine the roar of delight in 1716 when pirate Henry Jennings, cruising off the coast of Florida, came upon a Spanish galleon and found 350,000 pieces of 8. However, pirates often went home with nothing. Calico Jack Rackham, on a 2-year cruise in the West Indies, captured more than 20 ships, but most were fishing boats or small coastal traders. From one schooner, all he got was 15 rolls of tobacco and 9 bags of pimento. The handwritten list at right catalogues the various goods confiscated from Edward Davis and 2 other pirates when they were apprehended off Virginia in 1688. Davis and his mates were about to retire after 5 years of plundering in the Caribbean. Besides 5 bags of coins and assorted silver plate weighing 142 pounds, they also treasured fewer pair of silk stockings, 2 paper books, and several pieces of dampened ribbon. The 3 spent a year in the Jamestown jail before being freed under a royal pardon. They then boldly petitioned the king for the return of their swag, claiming that it had been taken illegally. They eventually got most of it smuggling it out, and colonial merchants compensated for their lack of goods from the world market by buying them from the pirates. In 1696, Edward Randolph, Surveyor General of the Customs in New England, sent back a memorandum to London entitled A Discourse About Pirates with Proper Remedies to Suppress Them. He wrote of the pirates, "In the 1670s I observed that they were fitted out vessels of 60 or 70 tons and sent them without commission to the Spanish West Indies, whence they brought home great quantities of silver coins and bullion, with rich capes, church plate and other riches, insomuch that the Spanish ambassador complained thereof. But now these pirates have found out a more profitable and less hazardous voyage to the Red Sea, where they take from the Moors all they have without resistance, and bring it so some of the plantations in the continent of America or islands adjacent, where they are received and harboured, and from whence also they fill out their vessels." The illicit rapprochement between the American colonies and the pirates was widespread by the 1690s. With few exceptions, colonial governors from New England to the Carolinas connived with the pirates. Rhode Island, Boston, and New York became pirate depots. In Pennsylvania, the Surveyor of Customs reported that the pirates behaved as if they owned the place. They walk the streets with their pockets full of gold, and are the constant companion of the chief in the government. They threaten my life and those who are active in apprehending them, carry their prohibited goods publicly in boats from one place to another for market, threaten the lives of the king's collectors, and with force and arms rescue the goods from them. All these parts swarm with pirates, so that if some speedy and effectual course be not taken, the trade of America will be ruined. Who were these extraordinary men, the pirates? What kind of fellows? Were they? What did they look like? On December the 20th, 1699, Governor Francis Nicholson of Virginia, one of the few anti-pirate colonial officials of this time, issued a warrant for the arrest of the crew of the Adventure, who had recently landed in Virginia after a pirate cruise to the Red Sea. The list of wanted men included John was the sea. Indeed, when a pirate ship was hailed in mid-ocean by another passing ship and asked who she was and whence she came, the traditional pirate reply was, "From the seas." This was a nice response, evasive but accurate, for by far the majority of all pirates were professional sailors, landlubbers with the exception of surgeons and sometimes musicians, were not popular recruits on pirate ship vessels. If a man was going to be part of the pirate community, he had to be able to tell a marlin spike from a sounding lead and fulfill all the normal requirements of a common seaman, furling, reefing and hauling about the ship. Some of the pirates were deserters from Royal Navy warships. Other Navy men drifted into piracy through unemployment caused by the laying up of fighting ships at the end of foreign wars. War is no sooner ended, John Graves, the Bahamas collector for customs, wrote in 1706, but the West Indies always swarms with pirates. But the vast majority of pirates were drawn from the crews of ordinary merchant ships. These recruits were commonly taken from captured ships, either as volunteers or as forced men. Often they were mutineers who had taken over their own ship and turned pirate after killing or setting adrift their captain and any shipmates who did not wish to join them. Undermanned pirate ships increased their strength or replaced losses caused by sickness, desertion and death in action with new men from captured cargo ships, or they reproduce themselves like amoebas. By splitting in two, a section of the original crew might go off on their own account, as they called it, in a spare prize. Pirate crews were rarely crack teams of battle-hardened men welded together by years of service at sea together. They were in every sense a floating population in a constant state of flux, never the same size or composition from one month to another, owing allegiance to nothing and to no one, neither ship nor captain nor cause. So let's talk about this picture in the middle. As his mother weeps bitterly here, a youth is sent away to sea, where, as his two companions gleefully point out, the cat o' nine tails awaits him, and the gallows may prove his fate. The engraving is one of a moralising series by Hogarth, showing what could happen to an idle apprentice, but life or the poor in 18th century England was often worse ashore than at sea. What made some men turn to piracy lay in the nature of their life at sea. A common grievance among sailors was the harshness of discipline on board merchant and navy ships. A 17th or 18th century sailor was subject to a whole repertoire of punishments and was the easy victim of sadistic or psychopathic officers. Some made their men swallow cockroaches or knock their teeth out and force them to gag on their own blood by jamming their mouths with iron bolts. Flogging was the most common punishment. The emotional impact of being flogged, quite apart from the physical damage, provided a powerful goad that drove men to piracy. Flogging could achieve an exceptionally barbarous level. Men could be flogged around the fleet, receiving 6 lashes alongside every ship. In 1704, Captain Staines of the Rochester had a sailor flogged 600 lashes with a tarred rope an inch thick. There is no record of whether or not the man survived, besotted mother pays no heed to her child who is toppled over a rail, or to the cadaverous trunk in front of her. In the background, a scowling pawnbroker ponders goods offered by drinkers desperate for cash. A suicide dangles from a beam, and a berserk cook prances by with a child impaled on a spit. So, a fairly distressing image of the time. It was a time of gross social and economic injustice in which the lower classes, be they sailors or landsmen, were considered little more than slaves to a despotic master. In 1688, by one scholar's estimate, 75% of Britain's national income went to barely 20% of her population, and while the gentry enjoyed their silks and carriages, the pale little children of the poor were sent out at the age of 7 to labour in the mines and mills for a mere shilling a week. They commonly died there, too, of fatigue, of cold, of heat, of some foreman's sadistic beating. Those who survived such treatment were chained to a life of crushing labour and marginal subsistence, lacking education, going without medical care, and facing years in a debtor's prison if they failed to produce so much as a farthing to repay a usurer's loan. It is no wonder that the pirate captain, Charles Bellamy, could turn to the stubborn captain of a captured merchantman who refused to join his pirate crew and rage at him. "Damn ye, you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security, for the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether, damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, they scoundrels do. Then there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had ye not better make one of us than sneak after the arses of those villains for employment?" Yet, if the all-pervasive injustice and harshness of the day mentally prepared a sailor for some kind of change, it was the lure of money that provided the strongest impetus. Sailors were not atrociously paid in comparison with their social equals on land. A seaman commonly got slightly more than £1 a month, whereas a labourer saw less than half that. But unless a seaman rose to the rank of master and was able to buy a share of his ship or his cargo, which happened rarely, he could not expect much more than an impecunious working life and an austere old age. Piracy could change this bleak prospect. In the great days of the pirate round, scores of ships returned with booty amounting to £1,500, £2,000, and at least once £4,000 per man. This sort of money was almost beyond belief in those days, equal to the annual income of the elite of England, the great landlords of the peerage. It was double the income of most merchants and bankers of London. By comparison, the governor of the East India Company in Bombay earned a salary of only £300 per annum, his senior agents £30, a clerk £5 a year. For a particular kind of disaffected sailor, the prospect of sharing in a real haul was irresistible. The rewards outweighed the risks, and since a man could be hanged for stealing a shilling, he had no compunction about stealing satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power, and who would not balance creditor on this side, when all the hazard that is run for it at worst is only a sour look or two at joking? No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and next time I will try not to wait quite so long to do the next part. I hope you enjoyed that. This is Kate at the Library of Whispers saying I shall see you very, very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Hello everybody. This is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to continue my reading all about pirates in this vintage book. This time I thought we would read about the infamous Captain William Kidd. Here he is. This chapter is called The Fateful Cruise of the Adventure Galley. So, William Kidd was famous Scottish privateer turned pirate, and he was executed in the early 18th century, and he was famous for apparently, or allegedly, burying treasure, which I don't think has ever been discovered, so let's read about it. During the afternoon before he was put to death, Captain William Kidd, ship's master and navigator of the Eastern Seas, naval hero and well-beloved agent of King William III of England, New York merchant and man of property, faithful husband and devoted father of two, but now, alas, a convicted pirate and murderer, was visited by one of the more sanctimonious bores of Newgate Prison, the chaplain, an ordinary Paul Loren. This busy divine gained his living in the present world and his hopes of salvation in the next by wringing confessions from condemned felons and publishing the juicy tidbits in moralising booklets which he peddled in the coffee houses of London. The prospect of imminent death being what it is, the Reverend Paul Loren usually had little difficulty At the front of the macabre procession, in an open carriage, came the Admiralty's Deputy Marshal, bearing over his shoulder the silver oar that symbolised the authority and power of the Admiralty. Behind him came the Marshal himself, the powdered and bewigged Mr. Cheek, on whom had fallen the responsibility of arranging the execution and the disposal of the bodies. Finally, flanked by constables, came a black draped tumbrel, carrying the condemned men. Kidd, his shipmate Darby Mullins, and another pirate not involved with their case. Amid the roar of the London mob, the cortege moved off at a walking pace, clattering over the cobbles of Cheapside, past the Royal Exchange and the Old Gate Pump, with the square keep of the Tower of London on the right, above the dark expanse of the Thames. The solemn pomp of the procession was intended to instil respect for the law among the citizens. But Execution Day was Fete Day in London, and Hangman's Fair at Wapping was celebrated as an occasion for orgies of all kinds. A great raucous crowd followed Kidd to his killing place. Low-class whores and hobbies lined the smelly little streets among the run-down tenements and hovels and cheap taverns, and they closed in behind the procession and screamed out for Arabian gold and rings and gems and pieces of eight. For pirates sometimes threw a few pieces of treasure to the crowd when they were on their way to be hanged. While others bawled out a ballad specially composed for the occasion, Captain Kidd's farewell to the seas. And here it is. My name was Captain Kidd, when I sailed, and so wickedly I did, God's laws I did forbid, when I sailed. I roamed from sound to sound, and many a ship I found, and then I sunk or burned, when I sailed. I murdered William Moore, and laid him in his gore, not many leagues from shore, when I sailed. Farewell to young and old jolly seaman bold, you're welcome to my gold, for I must die. Farewell to Lunnon town, the pretty girls all around, no pardon can be found, and I must die. Farewell, for I must die. Then to eternity, in hideous misery, I must lie. It was 2 hours before the procession reached Execution Dock at Wapping on the edge of the Thames mud flats, the gallows awash at its base at high tide, now stuck up out of the mud. Beside the scaffold stood the Reverend Paul Loren. He had gone on ahead in order to greet the prisoners, but when he set eyes on Kidd, he saw to his unspeakable grief that the captain was inflamed with drink, which had so discomposed his mind that it was now in a very ill frame, and very unfit for the great work now or never to be performed by him. The captain would still not confess his crimes or ask for forgiveness. He expressed abundance of sorrow for leaving his wife and children, recalled Loren. Indeed, the thoughts of his wife's sorrow were his arm before the rope snapped under his weight, tumbling him down into the mud. A great shriek went up from the crowd. Confused and stunned, Kidd was manhandled up a ladder and tied to the gallows tree a second time. The indefatigable Loren, seizing his chance, clambered up the ladder behind him and, balanced in this precarious position, tried one more time with urgent pleas to get the poor old sailor to repent his sins. So the old salt, not knowing exactly where he was or what was happening, gasped it out, and the chaplain, at last satisfied, climbed down. Then the hangman yanked away the ladder, and the judicial murder was complete. At the time of his death in 1701, and for generations after, Captain Kidd was popularly regarded as a maritime gangster of the most evil sort, the apotheosis of a cutthroat pirate, but nobody endured a worse reputation with less reason. No pirate of the day spilled less blood or captured fewer prizes, though not entirely by design. If he was a cause célèbre, it was because of political intrigue rather than actual crime. For the complex story of Captain Kidd's foray into the eastern seas is inextricably linked with the shadowy figures of some of the noblest men of the British realm, and in the end, they betrayed him. Little is known of the first 45 years of William Kidd's life. He was a Scot, possibly born on Greenock, probably in 1645. He presumably took to the sea when he was a boy, and he may have emigrated to America in his early 20s. In any case, by the early 1690s, he was a man of substance in New York. He had his own merchant ship and had distinguished himself as a privateer captain in the King's service against the French in the West Indies in 1689. Returning home, he married a lovely English woman, Sarah Ortt, who had outlived two previous husbands, though she was still only in her early 20s. Through his marriage, Kidd acquired New York property, which one day would be worth a fortune, 86 to 90 and 119 to 121 Pearl Street, 52 to 56 Water Street, and 25 to 29 Pine Street. Within a few years, Kidd was not only rich but respected. He held a pew at Wall Street's Trinity Episcopal Church. He was interested in politics, and he counted himself among the confidants of the Governor of New York, Colonel Benjamin Fletcher. In the mid-1690s, following the wildly successful pirate cruises of Thomas Tew and Henry Every, the eastern seas were alive with pirate vessels. Month by month, the toll of the great Mogul shipping mounted. Month by month, the position of the East India Company deteriorated, as outraged native rulers laid the blame on the company's English managers. At last, in 1695, the king agreed to relieve New York's governor. Fletcher, who was by then notorious for his dealings with Tew and other pirates, in his place as governor of both New York and New England, the king appointed the Earl of Belmont, an Irish Somers, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and the Duke of Shrewsbury, Secretary of State. In the summer of 1695, Kidd arrived in London with his sloop Antigoa after a trading run from New York. Here he chanced to meet Colonel Robert Livingston, a prominent New Yorker, who presented him with a grandiose scheme for ending Red Sea piracy and making a profit into the bargain. Livingston's idea was to dispatch a specially built privateer ship under a specially qualified privateer captain with the backing of a syndicate of influential men who would recoup their investment with the profits from captured pirate booty. Like all enterprises doomed to failure, this one was flawed at its heart. While it purported to be a praiseworthy act of international policing, it was in fact merely a device for making a financial killing of astronomical proportions. For the real target was not so much the pirates, but the prodigious plunder presumed to be in their ships. There was thus at the outset an ambiguity, a confusion of aims that was eventually to prove fatal to the man who was placed in command, William Kidd. Kidd seemed the ideal choice for this venture. He was an honest, reliable merchant sea captain. At the same time, as a former privateer in the King's service, he was a fighting sailor who knew the ways of pirates. Forthwith, Livingston hustled Kidd off to see the new governor of New York, Lord Belmont, at his London home on Dover Street. Belmont thought it all a splendid idea. He quickly put Livingston in touch with four of England's most powerful men, all close friends of the king. Up here. These were Sir John Somers, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal and subsequently Lord Chancellor, the Duke of Shrewsbury, Secretary of State, Sir Edward Russell, First Lord of the Admiralty, later Lord Orford, and the Earl of Romney, Master General of Ordnance. These gentlemen were only too pleased to put money into the venture, provided, of course, that their names were not mentioned. Even the King promised to put up £3,000, though in the end he never did. In October 1695, Livingston, Belmont and Kidd signed the Articles of Agreement. Belmont was responsible for finding 4/5, that's £6,000 of the cost. This sum coming from the four anonymous noble backers. Livingston and Kidd together put up 1/5. As was customary, the first 10% of any booty would go to the Crown. The remaining 90% would be split three ways: 60% for Belmont's backers, 15% for Kidd and Livingston, and only 25% for the crew, not the usual 60% of a privateering agreement. There was to be no share out of the spoil during the cruise, only at the end when it had been properly condemned by an Admiralty court. If there should be no booty, Kidd and Livingston were to pay back every farthing their backers had put into the venture. A few months later, Kidd was issued 2 special commissions. To overlay this private venture with an official veneer, one was a letter of marque, which empowered Kidd issued under the Great Seal of the Crown of England, empowering Kidd to seize pirates, in particular 4 named pirates including Jew and their ships, and merchandises, money, goods and wares. The commission referred to him as our trusty and well-beloved Captain William Kidd, but it also contained a prophetic warning: "We do hereby jointly charge and command you, as you will answer the same at your utmost peril, that you do not in any manner offend or molest any of our friends or allies, their ships or subjects." Now in this image here, we can see that this is a letter of marque. Led the unfortunate Kidd to believe that he enjoyed complete royal protection. Dated December the 11th, 1695, bears a sombre portrait of King William III. None of these arrangements was particularly advantageous to Kidd. To raise his part of the expenses, he had to sell his ship and a third of his interest to a London speculator. What he would get in return was dubious. There were few French in the eastern seas, and the chances of any crew of his capturing elusive pirates were slim at best. The whole enterprise was vague and equivocal. To give him his due, Kidd had tried to wriggle out of it at the start. He knew how fine was the service in the Navy, replacing them with a raging collection of Navy rejects. It was the kind of calamity that never should have occurred. In the first place, Kidd should have been far too seasoned a captain ever to make gratuitous insults to the Royal Navy, unless he had become giddy with power over his King's commission. And while there was never any actual proof that the press gang was in retribution, the entire incident was typical of Kidd's abysmal lack of judgment and luck for the brief remainder of his life. Kidd arrived in New York in July and did not leave until September. The sale of a French fishing boat he had captured as a lawful prize during the Atlantic crossing conveniently provided funds with which to purchase the provisions necessary for a long cruise to the Indian Ocean. But filling out the remainder of the 150-man crew was not so easy. New York was still a hotbed of piracy, the starting and finishing point of the pirate round. Kidd's proposed crew against pirates in the eastern seas was not likely to prove a popular proposition to seamen whose friends were pirates or who were pirates themselves. To attract any sort of crew at all, Kidd was forced to raise their share of the profits to 60%, though he does not appear to have informed his sponsors of this change. He eventually set sail with a full complement of 150 men, one of them his brother-in-law, Samuel Bradley, but it was a sorry lot he had picked himself. Even Colonel Fletcher, who was still governor, pending the arrival of Lord Belmont, had a low opinion of them. Many flocked to him from all parts, he wrote to the Board of Trade, men of desperate fortunes and necessities, in expectation of getting vast treasure. It is generally believed here that if he misses the design named in his commission, he will not be able to govern such a villainous herd. It took the Adventure Galley 5 months to reach the pirate island of Madagascar. The voyage does not seem to have reduced the arrogance that the Great Seal of the King's Commission had apparently induced in Kidd. He had already affronted the Royal Navy in the Thames. He was to do so again off the Cape of Good Hope. On December the 12th, 1696, about 100 miles northwest of Cape Town, he fell in with a Navy squadron under Commodore Thomas Warren. Kidd demanded from the Commodore some new sails to replace ones he had lost in an Atlantic storm. The Commodore curtly refused. Kidd then told him that his commission entitled him to aid, and if the Navy refused, it would seize the sails from the first merchant ship he encountered. Angry words were exchanged, and Commodore Warren threatened to press 30 of Kidd's men. The next morning, so Kidd, in the calm of night, sneaked away with the use of his galley's oars and sailed into the eastern seas without calling at Cape Town, where he would certainly have been arrested. Kidd was just as untactful with the East India Company. At Joanna Island, he was joined by an East Indiaman, flying a Navy pennant. Kidd told the East Indiaman's captain to strike the pennant, as only he, Kidd, had the right to fly a Navy flag. By virtue of his royal commission, the East India crewmen were so suspicious of Kidd that they kept their guns trained on him throughout his stay, and warned him to leave harbour before they boarded him. Kidd had thus earned a most dubious reputation before he had even set off on his Indian Ocean cruise. After taking on water at Joanna, Kidd made for the nearby cabin crew had earned a penny. Provisions were running low, and those who had been recruited in New York began openly to advocate piracy. On April the 27th, 1697, Kidd set sail northward to the Red Sea. From this point onward, the trap that Kidd had unwittingly laid for himself could be said to be well and truly sprung. So we have an illustration here. It says, costumed more like a courtier than like a seagoing cutthroat, Captain Kidd kicks his family Bible into a sandy grave in this 1837 depiction of one of the legends about the star-crossed captain. The story has it that Kidd launched his piratical career by burying the book near Plymouth Sound. In July 1697, the Adventure Galley dropped anchor off the small island of Perim in the Narrows at the mouth of the Red Sea. This was a favourite ambush spot for pirates, for the big convoys of Arab and other merchant ships from Mocha, chief port of the Yemen coffee trade, provided rich pickings. It was an appropriate spot, therefore, for Kidd to lie in wait, either for pirates or enemy, meaning French, prizes. Several times, Kidd sent a small boat through the Straits of Mocha. On the third reconnaissance, it returned with news that 14 or 15 ships appeared ready to sail, but for 3 weeks, Kidd rode at anchor, waiting for them to come. Through the Narrows, day after day, the sun burned down out of a cloudless white sky. The humidity reached saturation point, and the cooling southwest monsoon wind died, leaving only a stifling stillness upon a fiercely glittering sea. Kidd must have reviewed his options time and again. He was in an equivocal position. He had been sent out to capture pirates, and had been given a letter of marque, empowering him to take French vessels as well. But since it was customary for vessels to fly whatever flag they deemed convenient at the moment, it was not always easy to discover a ship's true identity. Indeed, it was sometimes impossible until the other crew chose to reveal its allegiance. What would happen if he set off in pursuit of a strange sail, and that ship resisted him? Suppose he pressed the matter, and lives were lost in the ensuing action. Suppose then that his target ship turned out to be neither pirate nor French, but Dutch, or infinitely worse, English. On the other hand, what would happen if he played it safe, and in so doing came home empty-handed? How would he then fulfil the onerous financial requirements of his contract? Clearly he had to be aggressive if he was to take prizes, but suppose he could find no pirates or Frenchmen, what then? What would be the position if he captured and plundered Moorish vessels? By a strict legal definition, that would be piracy, but the authorities back home had in the past winked at the practice, and Moorish ships were customarily regarded as fair prey by the captains of Christian privateers. Where was the dividing line between privateering and piracy anyway? Kidd himself was fundamentally averse to piracy, but his rapacious crew was not, and it was bringing intense pressure on him to take a prize, nationality be damned. And who, in that waste of Red Sea water, on the other side of the world, so far from home and government, cared what he did, or would ever know? Late in the evening of August the 14th, the fleet sailed out the next morning. The fleet was neither pirate nor French, and it is certain that some ships flew English or Dutch colours, and that they opened fire on Kidd. It is certain too that Kidd fired back, but what Kidd's intentions has never been made clear. Edward Barlow, master of the Sceptre, one of the well-armed English East India men escorting the convoy, observed Kidd's manoeuvres and formed his own conclusions. At first, Barlow did not notice Kidd until someone reported that there was one vessel too many in the convoy. By this time, the Adventure Galley was right in the middle of the Mocha fleet. He showed no colours, wrote Barlow in his log, but had only a red broad pennant out without any cross on it, which the Sceptre's master took to signify an order to surrender or no quarter given. Kidd appeared to have singled out a large Moorish merchant ship as a target. Feeling him out, Barlow, in the Sceptre, let Kidd come on until he was nearly abreast, before he hoisted his English colours and fired 2 or 3 guns at the Adventure Galley. By this time, the Adventure Galley was alongside the Moorish ship, and Kidd levelled a broadside at her, hitting her in the hull and sails and rigging. The Sceptre immediately gave chase, and the Adventure Galley hastily retreated under sail and oars. By next morning, Barlow recorded, the Adventure Galley was out of sight and gone for good. Kidd had taken neither prize nor plunder in the Red Sea, and his prestige among his men sank lower still. There seems now to have been unbearable pressure on him, to which, step by step, he appears to have given way. By the end of August, when he was off the Malabar coast of India, north of Goa, the Adventure Galley met with a small Moorish bark, manned by Moors under an English captain named Barker, and with a Portuguese mate on board. Technically, the Moorish bark was not a legitimate prize, but Kidd had already proved himself a wobbly sort of king's agent by firing on the Moorish vessel escorted by the Sceptre. This time, he allowed his crew to board the bark, and they brought back a bale of pepper and a sack of coffee that he let them keep for their own mess. For his part, Kidd forced the English captain to join him as pilot, and the Portuguese mate as linguister or interpreter, valuable assets on such a strange cruise in such strange seas. One might think that in the empty vastness of the Indian Ocean, a ship could get away with virtually anything without detection, but the ports where a ship could be reprovisioned were few, and their seafaring populations regularly travelled back and forth, spreading every story. By mid-September, when Kidd put in for wood and water at Karwar, a port on the Malabar coast, between Calicut and Goa, word had spread of his activities. 2 English officers of the East India Company trading factory boarded the Adventure Galley and demanded the release of Barker and the Portuguese. Kidd had the men locked in the hold and vigorously denied their existence, and eventually the officers left. But 2 of Kidd's crew, not liking the turn of events, jumped ship at this point and later made depositions to the East India Company station in Bombay that Kidd was going on an ill design of piracy. From Karwar, the chief factor of the East India Company wrote that Kidd was a very lusty man and exceedingly hard on his men. They went in awe of him because of his special commission from the king, and he was always threatening to knock their brains out with a pistol butt. They are a very distracted company, the factor continued, continually quarrelling and fighting amongst themselves, so it is likely they will in a short time destroy one another or starve, having only sufficient provisions to keep the sea for a month more. When Edward Barlow of the Mocha convoy reached Cornwall on October the 15th, the whole coast was talking about the pirate chaser who had turned pirate. At Calicut, Barlow noted in his log, Mr. Penning, the local East India Company manager, refused to provide Kidd with wood and water, even when Kidd informed him that he was sent out by the King of England. It was almost as though the ambiguity of Kidd's original contract and the conflicting pressures from his sponsors and his crew had produced in him a split personality, that he genuinely believed himself to be still a dutiful servant of the Crown, while appearing to others to act to the contrary. The cruise continued and Kidd wandered across the empty ocean. Finally, in early November, he overhauled a cargo ship, sailing chisel on deck. When the captain appeared, Moore shouted at him, "Captain, I could have put you in the way to have taken the ship, and have never been the worse for it." According to Barrett, this put Kidd in a passion, so much so that the lad took refuge below decks. Other hands remained up top. Moore continued to upbraid the captain. "You have brought us to ruin, and we are desolate," he railed. "Have I brought you to ruin?" cried Kidd. "I have not done an ill thing to ruin you. You are a saucy fellow to say those words." According to a sailor named Palmer, Kidd did not say saucy fellow, but lousy dog. To which Gunnermore screamed, "I am a lousy dog. You have made me so." All agree about what happened next. The captain, now beside himself with fury, yelled, "Have I ruined you, you dog?" And with that he seized an iron-bound bucket worth 8 pence of lawful English money, his prosecutors were to point out later, and crashed it against Moore's head, a little above the right ear. The gunner's shipmates carried Moore below as the captain cried out after them, "Damn him, he is a villain." Moore died the next day of a fractured skull. A stunned and sullen peace descended on the wretched Adventure Galley. Weeks went by. Then at the end of November, 4 leagues from Calicut, they sighted a sail. Kidd bore down on the vessel and ordered French colours to be run up, a ruse to make the stranger do the same. Sure enough, the ship hoisted a French flag in return. The ship was the Maiden, bound for Surat with a cargo of cotton, quilts, sugar, and 2 horses. Her captain and 2 officers aboard were Dutchmen. All of the seamen were Moors. The Dutch skipper explained to Kidd resting on a sandbar in the shallows. She could sail no further. Kidd had her stripped and her hull burned for its iron. He then fitted out the bulky Quedder Merchant for the voyage home, and began the difficult task of recruiting crew from the nautical flotsam drifting around the islands. He had plenty of time, for he had to wait 5 months before the northeast monsoons could blow him around the Cape. At last, on November 15th, 1698, the Quedder Merchant weighed anchor in St. Mary's Harbour. Kidd seems to have had no qualms about the wisdom of returning home. His family awaited him, he had property to attend to, and he undoubtedly believed that he still had enough cargo in goods, jewels, silver and gold to square accounts with his powerful sponsors. Captain Kidd was only 3 days out from St. Mary's when the East India Company wrote a letter from its headquarters in Surat to the Lords Justices in London, in which a number of extreme accusations of piracy were levelled against him. The charges fell on receptive ears. To Kidd's high-placed backers, Lord Somers, now Lord High Chancellor, Lord Orford, First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Shrewsbury, Lord Chief Justice, and Lord Romney, Privy Councillor. It had long been obvious that their opportunist effort at merchant venturing was a dismal flop. There had been no decrease in the incidents of piracy. As for Kidd, there had been no news but uncomplimentary rumour. Now it seemed their worst fears were confirmed. The response of the Lords Justices was vigorous and immediate. They ordered a naval squadron on the point of sailing to the Indian Ocean to capture Kidd. At the same time, the Admiralty dispatched a circular letter to the governors of the American colonies, ordering them to apprehend Kidd so that he and his associates be prosecuted with the utmost rigour of the law. Finally, with the object of isolating Kidd, a free pardon was offered to every pirate east of the Cape, except Kidd and 2 other captains, one of whom was Henry Every. The news spread like smoke throughout England. A first-class political scandal erupted as Tory opposition politicians ripped into the 4 Whig lords who had sent Kidd off in the Adventure Galley. William Kidd had become an arch-criminal, guilty of the most unspeakable crimes, and in the eyes of the government, the East India Company, the press, and the general public, he was found guilty before he had set foot on land, or so much as uttered a word. Such was the situation when, early in April 1699, Kidd made his landfall at Anguilla, in the Leeward Islands, and sent his boat ashore. It returned with devastating news. In every port of the colonies, in virtually every quarter of the known world, Kidd and his crew had been declared pirates, to be arrested on sight. For 4 hours, the Quedder Merchant rode at anchor. Some of the men wanted to scuttle the ship against a reef and then disperse, rather than sail into a port that was under English control. But Kidd would not run. He had been away too long. He was too old for an outlaw's life of exile. He would see the thing through. He had powerful friends in London and New York, and he had the 2 French passes from the vessels he had plundered, so he was not a pirate, or so he believed. He decided to make for New York, where he reckoned he could count on the protection of the new governor, Lord Bellamont, one of the first supporters of the Adventure Galley cruise. As Kidd sailed north, it was obvious to all that the Quedder Merchant had to be replaced. She was too big and distinguished transferred much of the Quetta merchant booty, including his own personal treasure, gold bars, gold dust, silver plate, precious and semi-precious stones, fine silks, to the Antonio, and then, with a crew of 12, the rest opting to remain, he sailed boldly for New York. On June the 10th, the Antonio rounded Long Island and anchored in Oyster Bay. Kidd had been away nearly 3 years. He had voyaged more than 42,000 miles, a distance greater than the circumference of the earth. The ship in which he had sailed was a ruined hulk on a tropic island. All but a handful of his crew were dead or pirating in the eastern seas, and he was an outlaw. Kidd's desperate gamble for life and freedom now entered its most critical stage. Everything depended on winning over Lord Bellamont, and to do this, Kidd pinned his hopes on his 2 French passes. From Oyster Bay, therefore, Kidd sent a letter to an old friend and neighbour of his in New York, a lawyer named James Emmett, asking him to come out to the ship. Emmett arrived in a day or 2, spoke with Kidd, then hastened to Boston, where Bellamont had his headquarters. Emmett saw Bellamont late on the night of June the 13th, proposed that he should grant Kidd a pardon, and handed him the French passes. Bellamont, who had received unequivocal orders to arrest Kidd, was in a difficult position. His own career was in the balance, and he dared not make any move that would cause Kidd to flee. On June the 19th, he sent a letter to Kidd by the hand of the Boston postmaster, Duncan Campbell, a friend of Kidd, this time £1,000 worth of gold bars sewed up in a green silk bag. She immediately sent them back. The next day, Kidd was interviewed by Bellamont, sitting in council in his house. The captain was coldly asked for a detailed account of his movements and leaving England. He replied somewhat truculently that his crew had destroyed his log. The governor and council ordered him to prepare a report. Kidd either could not or would not. Finally, on July the 6th, all patience at an end, the council voted for Kidd's immediate arrest. The police searched. High and low for the better part of a day, and eventually found him outside the front door of Bellamont's house. He tried to draw his sword, broke away, and rushed into the house. He was caught and his arms pinned in the presence of the chief instigator of the voyage for which he was now being accused, the Captain General and Governor-in-Chief, in and over His Majesty's provinces of the Massachusetts Bay and Governor of New York, His Excellency Richard, Earl of Bellamont. Bellamont had Kidd clapped into the stone prison in solitary confinement in irons weighing 16 pounds, and from the moment of his confinement he was treated like a wild animal. Monster is how Bellamont described the old captain to Lord Somers. For tainting its good name, the English establishment was to exact a terrible revenge. At the start, a frantic search was made to uncover Kidd's treasure. His lodgings were ransacked, and their contents, even his clothes and his wife's things, were bundled away. His gifts to various friends were collected, the sloops that had carried off cargo were tracked down, and his treasure on Gardiner's Island was dug up. 3 weeks after his arrest, an inventory was made of recovered booty: 1,111 ounces of gold, 2,353 ounces of silver, more than 1 pound of precious stones, 57 bags of sugar, 41 bales of merchandise. The entire proceeds were shipped under close guard to the Treasury in England. Summer passed, then autumn. With the onset of winter, the council became concerned that Kidd and his fellow prisoners might die of cold in the stone prison, and they were allowed warm clothing. In the new year of a new century, HMS Advice arrived to take the prisoners back to England. was in great want of his. Clothes. He was allowed no exercise until the new year, and no visitors except an elderly uncle and aunt. He was not allowed to write letters to his wife or to discuss his case with anyone or prepare his defence. He lay he was charged with the piracy of the Quetta Merchant, the Maiden, renamed the November, and 3 unnamed ships, 2 Moorish and 1 Portuguese. Kidd railed the prosecution, was an arch pirate, equally cruel, dreaded and hated both on the land and at sea. No one in this age has done more mischief, in this worst kind of mischief, or has occasioned greater confusion and disorder, attended with all the circumstances of cruelty and falsehood. The 2 king's witnesses, again the prosecution's only witnesses, went through their doctored stories over and over again. Kidd's cross-examination was inept and could not dent the impression that the witnesses had made. He claimed the Quetta Merchant and the Maiden were lawful prizes because of the French passes, and that a mutinous crew had forced him to capture the other vessels. However, he had no material witnesses to call on and no French passes to produce as evidence. In the end, Kidd realised the hopelessness of his position. "This man contradicts himself in 100 places," Kidd complained as Brandingham gave evidence. "He tells 1,000 lies." "Will you ask him any more questions?" the Solicitor General asked. No, Captain Kidd replied. "So long as he swears it, our words or oaths cannot be taken." "Will you ask him any more questions?" the court clerk repeated. No, it signifies nothing," Kidd muttered, and as the trial drew to a close, he broke in. "Mr. Brandingham, are not you promised your life to take away mine?" The jury was out for scarcely half an hour. They found Kidd and 6 of his co-defendants guilty. 3 were acquitted. "What canst thou say for thyself?" the clerk of the court asked Kidd. "Why, thou shouldst not die according to law." "I have nothing to say," replied Kidd, "but that I have been sworn against by perjured and wicked people." "You have been tried by the laws of the land," the clerk continued. "Nothing now remains but that sentence be passed according to the law, and the sentence of the law is this: you shall be taken from this place where you are, and be carried to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and there be severally hanged by your necks until you are dead, and the Lord have mercy on your souls." "My lord," said Kidd, "it is a very hard sentence. I am the innocentest person of all. Only I have been sworn against by perjured people." When Captain Kidd later discovered in their proper place, the Public Record Office in London. The gold, silver, jewels, silks and muslins from the Quetta merchant were forfeited to the Crown and sold by auction for £6,472. One of the buildings that now houses the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich was bought with part of Kidd's money. Though many have looked for Captain Kidd's buried treasure, no one has ever found it, because none remains. I hope you enjoyed the second part of Captain pirates had not seen for many a year. When Condon's company broke up at St. Mary's after the share-out, the beach was littered with unwanted luxuries, silks, gold-embroidered muslins, and spices of all kinds. Having such success, Condon and about 40 of his men decided not to risk their luck again and gave up piracy. They received a French pardon from the governor of Bourbon, later called Reunion, and settled down. According to Defoe, Condon married the governor's sister-in-law, emigrated to San Mayo in France, and became a wealthy shipowner. Following Condon across the Atlantic came a stream of dispossessed New World pirates, who now operated not only in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, but also all around the east and west coasts of Africa, wherever there was booty to be had. The Royal African Company and the East India Company reacted to this surge of piracy with predictable concern, and this time their entreaties had the desired effect on the Royal Navy. The Admiralty put Commander Thomas Matthews in command of a squadron of 4 men of war and dispatched him around Africa to the Indian Ocean. Arriving at Madagascar ahead of the other ships in his squadron and not wishing to dally, Matthews left a letter instructing his captains and sallied forth on patrol. The pirates intercepted this letter, and as so often in the past, most of them declined to confront the Royal Navy. Though Matthews never fought or captured any pirates in the Indian Ocean, his mere presence there was enough to convince them that the game was not worth the candle. They drifted away, some into retirement, a number around the Cape of Good Hope to the west coast of Africa, where for a time they continued their activities, and this was where Captain Bartholomew Roberts came on the scene. This greatest of the pirate captains was born around 1682, and probably, like virtually all his fellows, saw active service on board a naval ship or privateer during the prolonged War of the Spanish Succession. It is known that at the time of Blackbeard's exploits, he was the mate of a Barbados trading sloop. By his mid-30s, he was clearly an outstanding master mariner. In the pirates' parlance of the time, he was pistol-proof, meaning a man expert in ship handling, crew control, and the tactics of naval warfare. Roberts' very expertise was in all probability an important reason for him turning pirate after 20 years as an honest seaman. As a ship's officer of working-class origins, he could not have expected a command of his own in legitimate service at sea. Only as a pirate could he attain the supreme rank to which his training, experience and ability fitted him. Nevertheless, he was averse at first to taking up pirate life on Davis's ship. But then events led him to change his stance. 6 weeks after the engagement at Anamaboa, Davis was slain, pistols blazing, in a Portuguese ambush on Prince's Island, where he had put into reprovision. The pirates retreated out to sea in the Royal Rover to nurse their wounds, and there on the rolling ocean the crew elected Roberts captain. Clearly he had already proved himself to be their superior. Roberts accepted the position. If he was reluctant to become an ordinary pirate crewman, he apparently found that he could reconcile himself to piracy when he was chosen as captain. is better to be a commander than a common man, since I have dipped my hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, was how Roberts himself put it. What sort of man was this towering captain of pirate history? Defoe calls him black, implying that he was a swarthy, Celtic kind of Welshman. Though he was probably short in stature, like most Welsh hill people, he was blessed with a powerful personality and a natural flair for leadership, and he brought to his new rank as captain, or acquired, as a result of it, some of the mannerisms and affectations of the gentlemen officers of the regular navy quarter-decks. His style of dress served to emphasise his distinction from his men, rich crimson damask waistcoat, and breeches, red feather in his tricorn hat, gold chain around his neck, with a diamond cross suspended from it, 2 pairs of pistols on the end of a silk sling over his shoulders, and a sword at his side. He drank great quantities of tea, which was the gentlemanly thing to do, and he had a corresponding dislike for the sort of alcoholic excesses that pirate crews habitually indulged in, not because he was a Puritan, but because he believed drink impaired the efficiency of his ship. Being almost always mad or drunk, wrote Defoe of such men, their behaviour produced infinite disorders, every man being in his own imagination a captain, a prince, or a king. According to Defoe, when Roberts saw there was no managing of such a company of wild, ungovernable brutes by gentle means, nor to keep them from drinking to excess, the cause of all their disturbances he put on a rougher deportment and a more magisterial carriage towards them. He made every member of the crew swear to obey his articles, and was swift to enforce these rules. And if any seemed to resent his usage, wrote Defoe, he told them they might go ashore and take satisfaction of him, if they thought fit, at sword and pistol, for he neither valued or feared any of them. So let's have a little look at these pictures. So at the bottom here, this long illustration is African canoes paddle out to European vessels anchored beyond the bar on the Gold Coast, where bartering took place. One early English traveller found the Africans reluctant to come aboard until the captain splashed 3 drops of sea water in his eye as a sign of friendship. That's a strange thing to do, isn't it? Because you'd think that would hurt. I suppose that was the point, maybe. And then this little picture up here. This is flying the cross of St. George, symbol of British rule. Fort Charles looks out on the Guinea Gulf at Anamaboa, an important gold and slave trading station. Such forts generally mounted 25 to 30 guns and were virtually impregnable against local uprisings or pirates. largest, most heavily laden ship and plundered her of her cargo, including 40,000 gold moidores, worth £50,000 in English currency. The other merchantmen could only cluck and cackle in dismay, firing their cannon and raising their top-gallant sails as distress signals to the convoy's 2 men-of-war escorts, but the warship's commanders either By September 1720, Roberts was back in the Caribbean. From his previous experience, he knew West Indies was no longer the healthiest of places for a pirate, but the vagaries of wind and weather had left him no choice in the matter. Sailing south from New England, he had arrived at Dacida Island in the Lesser Antilles, where he took on provisions and water, and set off again with the aim of sailing back across the Atlantic to Africa. He meant to make his first stop at Brava, the southernmost point of the Cape Verde Islands, but the winds pushed him too far to the north, and he found it impossible to beat southward down to Brava against the prevailing southerly breeze. Instead, he was forced to return across the ocean and beat back down to the Caribbean on the northeast trades in the western Atlantic. He had already been at sea for some time. When he made the turn to go back across the Atlantic, and now another long voyage stared him in the face. For this venture, Roberts had only one hogshead of water remaining from the stores taken on at Dacida. It contained 63 gallons for a crew of 124 men. Eventually, as the days dragged into weeks, the pirates were down to one mouthful every 24 hours, and some were driven so mad with thirst that they drank sea water or their own urine. A number of the crew died of fluxes and apraxias, dysentery and fever. The ones who did best were those who drank nothing save their meagre ration. The day came when the men ran out of water altogether, and it seemed miraculous the next day when their soundings registered a shelving of the seabed, indicating the proximity of land. They anchored on their last waterless night in only 7 fathoms. Soon after they set sail the next morning, the lookout at the masthead sighted land. They launched their boat and it returned that evening with water from the Moroni River in Suriname on the northern coast of South America. Thereupon Roberts embarked on a campaign of heroic proportions in the Caribbean, and the Royal Navy be damned. He took dozens of prizes and impudently landed on shore, even under fire, in fortified harbours. He sailed boldly into the harbour of St. Christopher, now St. Kitts, in the British Leeward Islands. There he looted the shipping and landed a boat to rustle a few sheep well under the fire of fortress guns. A month later, the governor of the French Leeward Islands complained that between the 28th and 31st of October, these pirates seized, burned or sunk 15 French and English vessels and one Dutch interloper of 42 guns at Dominica. Basing himself off St. Lucia, Roberts inflicted such a toll on French shipping from Martinique that the governor there was forced to send a message to the governor of British Barbados pleading for help. The governor of Bermuda wrote home that the Martinique prisoners the pirates took in their encounters with the French were barbarously abused. Some were almost whipped to death, others had their ears cut off, others they fixed to the yard arm and fired at them as a mark, and all their actions looked like practices of cruelty. A few months later, the Martinique governor sent another call for help to the governor of the British Leeward Islands. That worthy responded by ordering the Royal Navy guard ship HMS Rose, one of the 4 ships that had escorted Woodes Rogers to New Providence, to set off in pursuit of Roberts. The Navy captain replied tartly, "You know, sir, you have no power to give me orders, but I will concert any affairs that shall be for my king's service, and I am sorry I was to say, "I wish you'd do the same." He then sailed in the opposite direction. Roberts displayed his contempt for those efforts by designing a new pirate jack, showing a figure of himself with a sword in his right hand, and each foot standing on a skull. One skull had written beneath it the initials ABH for a Barbadian's head. The other had AMH for a Martinican's head. The plate on his captain door bore the same design. By the spring of 1721, Roberts had nearly brought Caribbean shipping to a halt. Without prey, there was no longer anything to keep him in the Caribbean. He had retained 2 of the captured ships to carry his loot and to serve as backup fighting vessels. The hulls of these ships were full of plunder. He needed to exchange this merchandise for gold, for only in this concentrated, indestructible form could his crew realise the real wealth of their piracy. But the American ports were too dangerous for Roberts, and he knew that eventually, despite all the shilly-shallying, a powerful expedition would be sent against him. He held a conference with his crew, and they voted to attempt another passage back to Africa, where they could dispose of their loot. Right, let's have a look at this illustration at the top. So this says, "A fisherman dry codfish on Newfoundland, a fertile northern port of call for pirates." In this 1715 engraving, the brigands found easy pickings among the cargo-laden merchant ships that put in for reprovisioning before setting out on the long journey across the Atlantic. They also found eager recruits among the local fishermen who were tired of their hard life. At the beginning of April, Roberts and his crew set out on their eastward voyage. This time, Roberts found favourable winds, and the Royal Fortune made its landfall at Senegal. From Senegal, Roberts sailed to Sierra Leone. For 6 weeks, while they careened and refitted their ships, the pirates enjoyed the hospitality of the freelance English traders of Sierra Leone. Though the Royal Africa Company had an official monopoly on all English trade along the coast, about 30 of these illicit entrepreneurs had set up their own posts on the coast and up the major rivers. These merchants of fortune proved good friends of the pirates, much as the Madagascar traders had sustained the pirates of a generation before. The most prosperous among them was ex-buccaneer John Ledstone, called Old Crackers, who kept the most hospitable house on the coast, and had several guns mounted by his door with which he saluted the pirates whenever they arrived at his port. Another was Benjamin Gunn, who ran a port on the Rio Bungo and served as Robert Louis Stevenson's model for the Ben Gunn of Treasure Island. Yet there was no question of Sierra Leone's becoming a vast pirate hangout like Madagascar. The country was too unhealthy, the pirates and pirate traders too few, the Royal African Company too well established in its fortified posts along the coast. Still, the traders managed a modest business, sending their employees upriver in boats to swap brass pots, pewter pans, old guns and English gin for slaves, ivory and dye woods, which they sold to English merchantmen who had the courage to defy the Royal African Company by trading with them. It was from these traders that Roberts and his crew learned for the first time of the presence of 2 British men of war on the coast, the Swallow under Captain Challoner Ogle and the Weymouth under Captain Mungo Herdman, both for shape.